100%. There is one thing I might add to that. You talk about September 11th as the date that the siege of Vienna was finally broken, but I would also add that September 11th was also the date that the siege of Malta was finally broken. And so, yes, there are several September 11ths in history that were marked defeats for Islam. I can't say for certain that that's why they chose September 11th for the attacks in the United States, but I think it's a distinct possibility. Well, the title here is the Mayflower Compact and the Declaration of Independence. We are celebrating at this time of year the 250th anniversary of the Declaration, which means the 250th birthday of America as a nation. We could put it this way, that the Declaration established the nation. The Constitution established the government. The Declaration set forth the ideals of this nation. The Constitution set forth a practical means by which those ideals are to be realized in a society of imperfect, sinful people like you and me. But the true founding of America, I would say, is not even 1776. I would argue that the true foundation of America, the true founding, takes place in 1620 with the landing of the Pilgrims and the Mayflower Compact. I am chairman of the board of the Plymouth Rock Foundation, and so I have a great deal of interest in this subject. But I would add that some people would say it's not fair to give the Pilgrims and the Puritans and those settlers in New England all the credit. What about Jamestown? Jamestown came before. Well, Jamestown has acquired something of a bad reputation, I'm afraid, but some of that reputation is undeserved. Yes, they had problems at Jamestown, but there were Christian purposes in the founding of Jamestown, and I think it's important that we recognize these. They landed at Cape Henry near Jamestown on the 27th of April of 1607, and their first act was to erect a large wooden cross and hold a prayer meeting. And the colonists wrote on his memorial, that is Hunt, their first chaplain, they wrote on his memorial that we all received from him the Holy Communion together as a pledge of reconciliation, for we all loved him for his exceeding goodness. He planted the first Protestant church in America and laid down his life in the foundation of America. And when the Jamestown Company issued a true and sincere declaration of their intention, they said the principal and main ends, of which are easily derived to any means understanding, infiniteness, and yet great ones, were first to preach and baptize into Christian religion, and by propagation of the gospel, to receive out of the arms of the devil a number of poor and miserable souls wrapped up into death in almost invincible ignorance. Anyway, I could read a lot more there, but several of the attempts to spread the gospel from the Jamestown colony, one of them was by a pastor who came to the colony a couple years later by the name of Alexander Whitaker. And Whitaker wrote about the need to convert the savages, as he described them. He talks about how these people that he is seeing there in America, that they have the same understanding as we do, that they are of good mind, they have souls like we do. And he goes on to say, we all have Adam for our common parent. Yea, and by nature the condition of us both is all one, the servant of sin and slaves of the devil. Oh, remember, I beseech you, what was the state of England before the gospel was preached in our country? How much better were we then concerning our soul's health than these are now? Let the word of the Lord sound out, that it may be heard in these parts, and let your faith which is toward God spread itself abroad, and show forth the charitable fruits of it in these barren parts of the world. And yes, there was missionary effort, and one of the converts to Christianity as a result of this was Pocahontas. Now, as we know, Pocahontas married an English nobleman by the name of John Rolfe. There was a lot of opposition to this marriage in England, but the reason for the opposition is not what you might think. It's not because she was Native American and he was English. The reason was she was royalty. She was the daughter of the Powhatan, not just the chief, but an emperor. And John Rolfe was only a nobleman. But anyway, shortly after they were married, they determined to go to England to raise funds to establish a school for the Pamunkey Indians to teach them literacy and to teach them the Word of God. And unfortunately, Pocahontas died of a disease in England, and so the progress didn't take place as they had hoped. But let's go from Jamestown and not forget that they too made a contribution, but let's go on to the Mayflower and to the landing of the Pilgrims there in 1620. Now, the Pilgrims had intended to settle in the northern parts of Virginia. They had a contract with the merchant adventurers that they would give them a portion of everything that they earned for a number of years in return for passage and ship and so on and setting up this colony. But they would be under the control of the Virginia colony and under the Virginia colony's laws. But they were blown off course. And being blown off course, this was providential, I would say, because there really were no exact boundaries as to where the northern boundary of Virginia ended. But when they find themselves there in Plymouth Harbor, they're thinking, I don't think this is Virginia anymore. And this was providential because it meant that now they were free to draw their own articles of government. Not only free, but they were under an obligation to as well, because they recognized that man, due to his sinful nature, cannot live in a state of anarchy. And therefore, it was essential that they would establish a system of government before they came ashore. And so before they came ashore, the Pilgrims and some of those who came with the Pilgrims drafted a charter of government that we know today as the Mayflower Compact. And I would suggest to you that the Mayflower Compact is really the first written constitution for North America itself. In fact, John Quincy Adams in 1802 described the Mayflower Compact as the only instance in human history of that positive original social compact. And he said it is popularly believed to have influenced the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. We don't have the original of the Mayflower Compact. It has been lost somewhere. One member of our Plymouth Rock Foundation board is of the opinion that it might have gone back to England with the merchant adventurers and that it might still exist somewhere. And she is doing some research to try to recover it. And I certainly hope that she is successful. But here's essentially the text based on copies. Again, I'm reading here, and this is short, but I'm reading the basic charter that was drafted by these Pilgrims before they came ashore in 1620. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith, having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith, and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one of another, covenant and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof we have hereunder subscribed our names at Cape Cod the 11th of November, in the year of the reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, and Ireland the 18th, and of Scotland the 54th, Anno Domini 1620. And there we see the signatures of those Pilgrims. What are the principles of the Mayflower Compact? And why do I describe this as a charter of liberty? First of all, it is based upon morality, and morality in turn is based upon religion. Really, all law is based upon morality. We say we can't legislate morality, but you can't really legislate anything except morality. All law consists of is taking a moral principle and making it mandatory by giving it governmental force. Laws prohibiting stealing, laws prohibiting murder, other such laws as this, even laws that say thou shalt not drive more than 65 miles an hour on the interstate, because in so doing thou mightest unduly endanger the life and safety of thy neighbor, King James Version. Even that involves moral considerations. But it also shows the political theory of the Pilgrims and the Puritans. They were both Calvinists. They both felt that there were problems with the Church of England, but they disagreed with the solution. The Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England. The Pilgrims thought that's a lost cause. We need to separate from it, so they were called dissenters or separatists. And for this reason, the Pilgrims felt persecution in England more so than the Puritans did. They immigrated to the Netherlands for a sojourn of several years. They found the Netherlands kinder and gentler. They found some tolerance there. They were allowed to hold their meetings there. But they also saw laxness in the Netherlands, and they concluded that this couldn't be their permanent home either. And so they returned to England with the intent that they were going to depart for the United States, or rather, I should say, for North America. So the basic principles of the Mayflower Compact would be, first of all, that God is the source of governmental authority. Remember the language we use there? In the name of God, amen. And they do what they do in the name of God, in the presence of God, for the glory of God, and for the advancement of the Christian faith. They recognize that God has all governmental authority, but that he delegates a portion of that authority to the people, and the people in turn grant authority to their rulers, the lesser first, and from them to the higher magistrates. Part of the dispute that we see sometimes is when we talk about representative government here in America. We hear all power to the people. Does this mean that all power comes from the people? Vox populi est vox Dei, as they sometimes say, the voice of the people is the voice of God. Is that what it means? Is that a humanist concept? I would suggest to you that my home state of South Dakota has a motto that puts this together very well. South Dakota's state motto is, "Under God, the people rule." Now, this certainly does not mean they're against kings, but it does mean that kings derive their authority from God, but indirectly from God. They derive their authority from God through the people. And that means that they govern by consent of the people. But the people could consent to establishing kings. In fact, government without kings in Europe in 1620 was almost unheard of in Europe. It will become somewhat more common by 1776, and much more so by 1787. But even at the time of the Declaration of Independence, they recognized that George III, was a tyrannical king. They don't object to him because he was a king. They object to him because he was a tyrannical king. And way back in 1620, though, they're willing to recognize that, yes, he is our dead sovereign and Lord King James by the grace of God, and of Great Britain, the British Union, and of France. There were several portions of France that England had claimed ever since the War of Agincourt and so on, and of Ireland, North Ireland at least. So they recognized that King George has authority, or I'm sorry, King James has authority by the grace of God. Even though James has said, I will make them conform, or I will harry them out of the land, they're still willing to recognize his authority. And furthermore, they recognize all this when they say this is all done in the year of our Lord, Anno Domini, 1620, and during the reign of James I of England, France, and Ireland, the 18th year, and of Scotland, and he is a Scot, Scotland, the 54th year. Then they say that we are on this voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, but we are no longer in Virginia, and therefore we need to draft our own covenant of government. And so they do so. They do so by means of this social compact. Even Puritans recognized the idea of a social compact. In fact, John Winthrop, as he describes the mission of the Puritans, he says, God has given us leave to draw our own articles. They have to be in conformance with his higher law, but we have liberty to draw our own articles, provided they're in conformity with his higher law. But as they come together with this compact, where do they get the idea that government is by compact? People immediately say, well, obviously they got that from John Locke. John Locke is the author of social compact theory. No, the Pilgrims are almost a century before John Locke. They get it from the Bible, from the covenant that God made with Noah. In fact, Locke even refers to the paction or pact that God made with Noah, and further to the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant. But also, they would have learned a great deal about the doctrine of social covenant from some of their experiences in the Netherlands with thinkers there, Reformed thinkers like Hugo Grotius, who wrote probably the first Christian or first Protestant work on apologetics of the truth of the Christian religion, and then from there to his political works, The Law of Nations, and so on. But at any rate, Grotius talks extensively about this doctrine of social compact, and very likely the Pilgrims would have derived their concept of social compact from him. They go on to say that under this compact, we are authorized to draft such just and equal laws. Laws must be just, that is, they must be in conformity with the higher law of God. They must be equal, that is, they must apply equally to all people who are similarly situated. Laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices. And so they're doing much like those in the Declaration of Independence do, but also much like the Constitution, where we begin with those words, we the people, for 6 different purposes, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Principles, then, that we see in the Mayflower Compact, first would be this recognition of a higher law. And I would suggest to you that in the world today, that is probably the most basic issue facing law and jurisprudence anywhere. Is law simply the product of man? Is law simply because some human authority has set it as law and has the muscle to back it up? Or does law have to be in conformity with some higher law? And what higher law could there be than the law of man, other than the law of God? Second principle, as we've already said, that government power comes from God through the people. Again, I refer back to the conflict between the Puritan Parliament and the Stuart Kings. Part of the reason they felt the need for this compact, though, and felt the need they had to have this before they ever set foot in America, was the sinfulness of human nature. They clearly recognized that people are sinners, and being sinners, they recognize that we need restraint. But they also recognize that just as we need restraint, so government needs restraint as well. John Cotton, for example, put it this way, Puritan preacher, Let all the world learn to give mortal men no greater power than they are content they shall use, for use it they will, and unless they be better taught of God, they will use it ever and anon. For whatever transcendent power is given will certainly overrun those that give it, and those that receive it. There is a strain in a man's heart that will sometime or other run out to excess unless the Lord restrain it. And he speaks about the need to restrain then all political power. And that's the concept of government with checks and balances and the like, such as our founding fathers developed. That was the question that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention faced. James Madison, I think, put it very well. And Lucas has talked about John Witherspoon. And in my Christianity and the Constitution, I have a chapter on Witherspoon, but I'm sure he has far, far more to say than I've ever said on Witherspoon. But Witherspoon there at the College of New Jersey trained a number of leading Americans, among them James Madison, who some call the father of the Constitution. Madison, in the Federalist Papers, says of government, "What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature?" And I'd suggest to you that political and economic theories go astray more than for any other reason, because they are based on a false view of human nature. If people were good, maybe socialism would work. If people were good, maybe absolute power in government would work. But people aren't good, and so that doesn't work. Madison went on to say then, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. We wouldn't need government if we were good. But he seems to be suggesting that we're not angels. And then he says, if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In other words, even if we were not good, if we had a group of wise, benevolent philosopher kings, we could give them absolute power and trust they'd wield it in everybody's best interest. But Madison is saying our rulers aren't good either. And you might have begun to suspect that he's right on that. And so he says, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. We must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. And so one of the basic principles of government that we see not only among the Pilgrims, but in New England in general, was decentralized government, with the township being the basic unit of government. And everyone had certain obligations to serve in militia service, or watch and ward, as they called it sometimes, to constable service and so on, but obligations of each. But the laws not only had to be just, they also had to be just and equal. That is to say, fair to all. They had a criminal justice system there in Plymouth, similar to what they had in much of the rest of New England. I might say that the Pilgrims were much like the Puritans, but maybe because they had faced such persecution themselves, maybe they were just a little bit kinder and gentler than the Puritans were. For example, we see that witchcraft was made a capital offense, just as it was in Salem. But unlike in Salem, where you had numerous prosecutions and approximately 24 people hanged, none burned for witchcraft. But in Plymouth, you had only 2 prosecutions in Plymouth. One of them never went to trial. The other resulted in an acquittal. The most common criminal offenses were theft, drunkenness, minor sexual offenses. Adultery was a capital offense, but other sexual offenses were treated more lightly. Minor quarrels among them. And punishments would consist of, for example, branding, brief periods of jail, but not really prison. In fact, the main purpose of jail was to hold somebody, if necessary, pending trial. Banishment from the colony, sometimes temporarily, occasionally permanently. Whipping, stocks, humiliation, and humiliation was considered to be a very important part of criminal justice. Without humiliation, sometimes there is no way of getting people in line. And that was true not only in the New England colonies, it was true in the southern colonies as well. Southern colonies are Church of England, but many times they would utilize the church as a means of administering punishment. There's one example in Norfolk County in Virginia, for example, of a woman who was convicted of having slandered a neighbor, and she was ordered to ask forgiveness in front of the congregation in church. She refused. And then she was ordered to appear in court on a charge of contempt. She refused to appear in court, and so in her absence, the court issued this order: the sheriff shall take her to the house of the commissioner, and there she shall receive 20 lashes. She is then to be taken to church the next Sabbath to make confession according to the former order of the court. If she refuses, she is to be taken to a commissioner and given 30 lashes, and again given an opportunity to do penance in church. If she still refuses to obey the order of the court, then she is to receive 50 lashes. If she continues in her contempt, she is to receive 50 lashes, and thereafter 50 every Monday until she performs her penance. Sometimes these records are incomplete, so we really have no idea how long that condition persisted. But that would be true not only in the Puritan New England colonies, but it would be true in much of the rest of the colonies as well. But the laws there in New England were largely based upon biblical law. In fact, they would often have a clergyman who had some legal training draft their legal codes. The legal code, for example, was drafted by the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, approximately 1640, contains this language: Section 1 of Article 94, capital laws. If any man, after legal conviction, shall have or worship any other god but the Lord God, he shall be put to death. Section 2, if any man or woman be a witch, that is, hath or consulteth with a familiar spirit, they shall be put to death. Section 3, if any person shall blaspheme the name of God, the Father, Son, or Holy Ghost, with direct presumptuous or high-handed blasphemy, or shall curse God in the like manner, they shall be put to death. But also, as they followed biblical law, they were many times very careful to ensure that the portions of biblical law that protected the accused were also given much recognition. There was one occasion that John Winthrop records of a couple of three defendants who had apparently taken indecent liberties with a young girl, and they confessed that they had taken these liberties, but said there had not been actual intercourse. And so we said the court was much divided about the sentence. The foulness of the sin and their long continuance in it wrought strongly with many to put them to death. But after much dispute and some remaining doubtful, the court agreed upon another sentence. The only reason that saved their lives was that the sin was not capital by any express law of God. Then we read another instance of a couple that were found in bed together, but claimed that there had never been any actual sex. And since they did not have corroborating witnesses, in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses let everything be established, and did not have witness of actual adultery, the court records say, whereupon, the case seeming doubtful to the jury, they judged it safest in case of life to find as they did. So the court adjudged them to stand upon the ladder at the place of execution with halters or nooses about their necks 1 hour, and then to be whipped, for each of them to pay 20 pounds. So, point of the matter is, yes, the laws were strict, but they understood they were dealing with sin, and they had to deal with sin by the law as well as by the gospel. Well, it's interesting to see that most of what we know about the Pilgrim colony we know from Bradford's History of Plymouth Plantation, a work that I recommend to you very highly. It is written over a period of years in the 1630s and 40s, and Bradford himself served for many, many years as governor of the Plymouth colony, but it didn't get published until 2 centuries later. They didn't have any online version of it. They didn't have it saved in their Word documents, much less PDF. In fact, they didn't even have a carbon copy, if any of you remember what that was. There was only the Bradford manuscript, and the manuscript was kept by his son, and the son's house went through a fire, and the manuscript was one of the few things saved in the fire. Went from there to the grandson, and there was a flood, and it was one of the few things saved in the flood. And then it was placed in the tower of the Old North Church in Boston until the War for Independence came. And at that time, the British occupied that church and made it into a livery stable. And after the war was over, the manuscript had vanished. It was referred to often as the lost Bradford manuscript. We had various quotes from it, but we did not have the actual manuscript itself. And then Bishop Wilberforce had written his History of the Protestant Church in North America, and one scholar was reading this work, and he saw in this work certain quotations from the Bradford manuscript that we didn't have in America, so he said, maybe the manuscript survives in England. And so a Massachusetts senator by the name of George Hoar, H-O-A-R, went on a crusade to recover the manuscript. He went to England and searched and learned that the manuscript was in all probability in the library of the Anglican archbishop. He tried for days to get an appointment with the archbishop, and the archbishop would not see him. Shortly before he was to return to the United States, this is just a few years before 1900, he was there at the inn, and the innkeeper said, "What could I do to lift your spirits, Senator?" And he said, "Give me an appointment with the archbishop." He said, "Well, the archbishop is a friend." And he arranged the appointment, and the manuscript was returned, and it's published. We sell it on our website of plymrock.org, the website of the Plymouth Rock Foundation. And I believe that the preservation of the Bradford manuscript is every bit as much a miracle as the preservation of the Plymouth colony itself. And if God preserved that manuscript, he did so for a reason. He did so because he wants us to read it, to learn from it. I was asked one time when I was lecturing in Plymouth, well, how much did the Bradford manuscript influence the Declaration and the Constitution? And I had to say not much, because it was lost during that time, but it certainly should influence the way we look at government today. Well, here's something that often happens, though. Frequently, we find that when you have a society that is filled with zealous Christians, that over a period of several generations, the zeal tends to fade. And that was true in America, and true in Puritan New England. First of all, by 1700, probably the distinction between Pilgrim and Puritan had pretty much evaporated, and the Pilgrims were pretty much absorbed into Puritan society in New England. But at any rate, at that time, we find that you come into the late 1600s, and some of the zeal has faded. It's not quite what it was. Oh, you have people who are still Christians, sound in doctrine, hopefully sound in lifestyle as well, pillars of the church. And then you move to further generations and things change again. You might find this in a family. Let's say you have a homeschool family where you have a father and mother who are really zealous Christians. Maybe they even found a church, and they raise their children to be zealous Christians as well. Maybe they're not quite the pioneers that their parents were, but they're solid. Then comes the next generation, and they still have the form of Christianity and perhaps believe it to some extent, but the zeal is no longer there. And by the time you get to the fourth generation, even the outward form is gone. And a lot of this was happening in America, and particularly happening in New England. By the time you get into the early 1700s, much of that old Puritan zeal had faded. It wasn't all gone, but it had faded. And you have people there who don't want to attend church, don't want anything to do with it. Maybe they have to, but they want very little to do with Christianity. However, you still had in New England the requirement that you have to belong to the church in order to have a part in civil society. You can't vote in civil government. You can't hold office in civil government unless you are a member in good standing of the church. And you can't be a member in good standing of the church unless you give evidence that you are elect of God. Well, so we get down into the 1700s, and there are people who are maybe good, solid members of the community, might make good city councilmen or county sheriffs and so on, but they give no evidence of election, so they can't belong to the church, and so they can't vote, and they can't hold public office. And this presents a very difficult situation. And Samuel Stoddard, who is related to Jonathan Edwards, then proposed something that was called the halfway covenant. The halfway covenant simply said that they could belong to the church, but they wouldn't be communicant members. But they'd still be non-communicant members of the church, and therefore they could vote in civic affairs and they could hold public office. Jonathan Edwards himself strongly opposed this, and Jonathan Edwards said, there is no such thing as a halfway covenant with God. And Edwards said, I would prefer to separate the whole idea of church membership from civic privilege entirely, rather than corrupt the church with this halfway covenant and people who are not really believers. I would rather, he is saying, have a church in which believers are those who hold firm to the truths of Christianity and give clear evidence of their election, even if that's a minority, than to have a majority church of lukewarm, halfway covenant believers. But anyway, so it might seem as we're moving into the 1700s that the Christian zeal of which America was founded was fading. And I've talked about this Christian zeal that we see in New England. It isn't quite the same in the other colonies, but there was Christian zeal in each of the colonies in various forms. But it's fading by this time. But then something changed. A stirring of God that we call the Great Awakening, or sometimes we call it the First Great Awakening. Two leading people in this Great Awakening are George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, and those two you could probably describe as a study in contrasts. Edwards is an American, he's a Puritan, and in keeping with the Puritan form of the time, he was an intellectual, and in fact, some secular writers who are not Christians have described Jonathan Edwards as the greatest intellect that America has ever produced. He was a writer, but his style was soft. We think of the sermon that he preached, sinners in the hands of an angry God. And we think how people were stirred by this. They were rolling in the aisles and moaning and grief over their sins. And you think, oh, here must be a real hellfire and damnation preacher who's pounding the pulpit and yelling. No, in fact, Jonathan Edwards delivered that message, as Puritan preachers generally did, in a very soft tone, very scholarly tone, read his message from the pulpit that way. And yet, people were so convicted by the power of what he had to say that they turned their lives to God. George Whitefield was from England, spent some time in Ireland as well, but Whitefield was the opposite. Whitefield was English. He was an Anglican. He was an actor, in fact. He was an evangelist. He was a powerful speaker. He had a very powerful voice and could use his voice in magnificent ways. In fact, it was said that he could cause an audience to burst into tears simply by pronouncing the word Mesopotamia. Let me try that. No, I guess I just don't have it. Okay. But anyway, he was born in 1714 in Gloucester, England. His parents were innkeepers. As a child, he had a passion and talent for acting in the theater, and later started acting Bible stories in his sermons. He was a good student, but he had no money, so he came to Oxford. But at Oxford, he came there as a servant of wealthier students. He joined a group that was called the Holy Club. The Holy Club was founded by John and Charles Wesley and had other leading Christian leaders in the organization. He became very ill while he was there at Oxford, and this, plus his reading of the scriptures, led to his conversion. And then he began preaching, and preaching passionately. He was ordained as an Anglican, but many times the Anglican leaders would not allow him to preach in their churches because his style was so flamboyant, so different from theirs. And so he began preaching out in the open fields, out in open air. And he preached largely to miners and to working class people. And then he came to America in 1738 through the Wesleys in Savannah, Georgia. He saw the orphans there, the need for orphanages and the like, and that became central. And so he began preaching throughout America, and his preaching throughout America led to this first Great Awakening, this religious revival of 1740. John Miller, who has an excellent biography of Samuel Adams, and we sometimes call Samuel Adams the father of the American Revolution, but Samuel Adams was a devotee of the Great Awakening. But here's what John Miller says about the Great Awakening. He says, the Great Awakening swept over the country, and Harvard, that's where Sam Adams went to school, Harvard became a new creature, filled with devout young men who had experienced the new birth. George Whitefield was welcomed to New England as an angel of God and messenger of Jesus Christ, and there were few students at Cambridge able to resist his hot gospel. Harvard again became a citadel of righteousness, and the clergy exulted over the sweet work going on at Cambridge, Massachusetts. When Whitefield first visited the college, he was dismayed at the laxity he found. Tutors did not pray with their pupils, and their favorite theologian was Tillotson, whom Whitefield declared knew less of Christianity than Muhammad. But after the religious awakening of 1740, it was said that only voices of prayer and praise were to be heard in students' rooms, and Tillotson and Clark were set aside for Flavel and the Mathers. Indeed, the piety of the college became so formidable that even diverse gentlemen's sons who came to Harvard prepared to spend 4 years in sloth and pleasure were suddenly seized with remorse and became so zealous for Christ's cause as to devote themselves entirely to studies of divinity. In Boston, where the congregational clergy had for many years past seen the devil making great strides, the Great Awakening brought about a week of Sabbaths, taverns, dancing schools, and assemblies, which had always proved unfriendly to serious godliness, were deserted for prayer meetings and sermons, and religious conversation became almost fashionable at every opportunity. Whitefield put a damp upon polite diversions and beseeched his listeners to shun the snares Satan had laid for them in fashionable dress. His exhortations produced startling changes in Boston. Young men and women were cast off their finery and walked along the fashionable Boston Mall, built in the imitation of St. James Park in London, wearing the somber dress seen in the heyday of Puritanism. He goes on to talk about its effect upon Samuel Adams. Sam Adams never forgot those stirring days during the Great Awakening, when George Whitefield thundered in the pulpit against assemblies and balls, and New Englanders seemed to turn the clock back to the time of Winthrop and Cotton. The glimpse Adams caught of Puritanism in 1740 had profound influence upon his later career. It became one of his strongest desires to restore Puritan manners and morals to New England. In his eyes, the chief purpose of the American Revolution was to separate New England from the decadent mother country in order that Puritanism might again flourish, as it had in the early 17th century. Adams hoped to do by means of a political revolution what Whitefield had done through a religious awakening. Puritanism was his goal, revolution his method of attaining it. It's also interesting to see the effect that the Great Awakening had upon, and this might seem a pretty unlikely source for you, but Benjamin Franklin. Franklin, we hear commonly described as a deist, which I think is an unfair characterization, entirely unfair. Unitarian, perhaps, in all probability, not an Orthodox Christian, but it seems as though Franklin was primarily influenced by what worked. He was a pragmatist. And if something brought about good results, he was for it. He exhorted his daughter in a letter one time. He said, "Go constantly to church, regardless who is preaching." And he says, "You will derive more from the liturgy of the Book of Common Prayer, perhaps, than from the messages. But just being there will have a good influence upon you." But here's what Franklin says about Whitefield. In 1739 arrived among us from Ireland the Reverend Mr. Whitefield, who had made himself remarkable there as an itinerant preacher. He was at first permitted to preach in some of our churches, but the clergy, taking a dislike to him, soon refused him their pulpits, and he was obliged to preach in the fields. The multitudes of all sects and denominations that attended his sermons were enormous, and it was matter of speculation to me, who was one of the number, to observe the extraordinary influence of his oratory on his hearers, and how much they admired and respected him, notwithstanding his common abuse of them, by assuring them that they were naturally half beasts and half devils. It was wonderful to see the change soon made in the manners of our inhabitants. From being thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious, so that one could not walk through the town in an evening without hearing psalms sung in different families of every street. Franklin goes on to describe Whitefield's plan of building this orphanage in Georgia and soliciting funds in Pennsylvania for the orphanage. And he says, "I do not disapprove of the design, but as Georgia was then destitute of materials and workmen, and it was proposed to send them from Philadelphia at a great expense, I thought it would have been better to have built a house here and brought the children to it. This I advised, but he was resolute in his first project, rejected my counsel, and I therefore refused to contribute. I happened soon after to attend one of his sermons, in the course of which I perceived he intended to finish with the collection, and I silently resolved that he should get nothing from me. I had in my pocket a handful of copper money, 3 or 4 silver dollars, and 5 pistols in gold. As he proceeded, I began to soften, and concluded to give the coppers. Another stroke of his oratory made me ashamed of that, and determined me to give the silver. And he finished so admirably, that I emptied my pocket wholly into the collector's dish, gold and all." In fact, Franklin was quite impressed by Whitefield's ability to preach and to reach huge crowds. On one occasion, Franklin saw him preaching in the town square. Ever the scientist, Franklin calculated how many people could be gathered in that town square, and then he saw people lined up row after row after row in the 4 streets that led to the town square, and he calculated that Whitefield was preaching to a crowd of 30,000 people. Now, here in this room, we're using a microphone, although some of us probably could make ourselves heard without a microphone, but 30,000 people in the open air. And anyway, even today, that orphanage that Franklin contributed to and that Whitefield developed or even today, it consists as a boys' school. Jonathan Edwards' wife, Sarah, remarked about him that he makes less of the doctrines that our American preachers generally do, and aims more at affecting the heart. He is a born orator, She's not talking about Jonathan. She's talking about Whitefield. A prejudiced person I know might say this is all theatrical artifice and display, but not so will anyone think who has seen and known him. 1770, at 55 years of age, he still had a strenuous preaching schedule. He said, "I would rather wear out than rust out." And his last sermon, he had a bad cold and difficulty breathing, but he still preached in a field atop a large barrel. And even then, he was preaching of the inefficiency of works to maintain salvation. And one listener recounted to the press, he said, and suddenly he cried out in a tone of thunder, "Works! Works! A man gets to heaven by works? I would as soon think of climbing to the moon on a rope of sand." And the following morning he died. It's estimated that in America he preached about 17,000 sermons in all of the 13 colonies, from New Hampshire all the way down to Georgia. And the same message in all of them. He crossed distinctions of class, of colony, of denomination. And Wake Forest history professor Terry Matthews says that one of the major results of the Great Awakening was to unify 4/5 of Americans in a common understanding of the Christian faith and the Christian life. Americans, North and South, shared a common evangelical view of life. Another effect was that he probably caused the dissenting churches to go. Many of those who either trusted Christ as a result of his crusades or else rededicated their lives to Christ, many of those started going to the dissenting churches, which would be the Presbyterian, the Baptist, the Methodist, and to a lesser extent the Lutheran churches, and left the Church of England, or in New England, the Congregational. And so one of the results of this then is that there was a greater drive for not having one established church. After all, why should we be supporting the Church of England as the established Church of Virginia when we're not part of the Church of England anymore? So those are a few of the effects. But the main effect is it arrested that slide away from Christian zeal of the Puritans of the early 1600s. However, it didn't mean a return to Puritan thought. We would say that after the 1740s, America was very distinctively evangelical Christian, not necessarily Puritan, probably still Calvinist, although not Puritan Calvinist as it would have been before. So it wasn't a revival of the Puritans, but it certainly arrested the slide into immorality and unbelief and Unitarianism. Now, there's one other thing I'd like to say before I go here, and getting a little more to what Lucas was talking about. There's one other movement going on here, and that's over in England. We have seen what's happened there with the great revolution, the glorious revolution of 1688, in which King James II is forced to abdicate without any bloodshed, and then the English Bill of Rights, and we see a true Protestant, William of Orange, becoming king then. We see that happening. But the Stuart kings, they flee off to the continent, to France, and sometimes to Rome. And then in the 1740s, Bonnie Prince Charles, comes to Scotland. He comes to Scotland intending to use his Scottish heritage to restore the Stuart rule to the British Isles. Probably some there in the continent were using him to do this. Now, this created quite a stir in Scotland. After all, you have the Lowland clans who are largely Presbyterian, and they look at Bonnie Charlie and they say, well, we don't like that he's a papist, but at least he's a Scot. And then the Highland clans, many of them had never really left Catholicism, and they followed him all the way. Well, Bonnie Prince Charles was an inspiring leader. I'm not sure how competent. He won several battles, but at this point he was very close to London and could have performed a strike on London, which was largely unguarded. But the Scottish chiefs said, no, we didn't bring you here to become king of England. We bring you here to be king of Scotland. And so he had to retreat from that, probably lost his great moment at that time. And then at the Battle of Culloden, he was badly defeated, and he and his men had to flee. He finally fled to the Isle of Skye and anyway went back to Europe and apparently ended his life as an alcoholic. But at any rate, that was the great moment. Thousands upon thousands of Scots had to flee. Hundreds, if not thousands, were executed very cruelly simply for siding with Scotland against England. In English view, since Scotland was part of England, that was treason. But of those that had to flee, many of them came to North America. And as Lucas has said, they form much of the backbone of the American War for Independence. So, besides being a revival of the Great Awakening, we can also say that the American War for Independence was Scotland's revenge. With that, I'll close, and we'll talk more about the political and religious situation in America in 1776 tomorrow morning.